Hello, I am Dr. Melanie Schemberger, and I am pleased to share The Woman with the Voice and the Pen, how Dorothy Dix fought for suffrage and challenged women's demoralizing place in society and the courts. My work on Dorothy Dix has stemmed from my undergraduate days at Western Kentucky University. However, this presentation was made at the Tennessee Philological Association conference held February 19, 2021, but I am happy to share with you my work. For more than half a century, Elizabeth Meriwether Gilmer, best known by the pen name of Dorothy Dix, advice columnist and crime reporter born in 1861 into a wealthy slaveholding family in Montgomery County, Tennessee, influenced generations of readers as she offered solutions to their problems and advice on living. Dix is best remembered for her personal advice column, Dorothy Dix Talks, and is regarded as the predecessor to the columns of Ann Landers and Abigail Van Buren, better known as Dear Abby. But Dix earned her national reputation under the term of sob sister during the 15 years that she worked for William Randolph Hearst New York Evening Journal as its leading crime reporter, concentrating mostly on murders and trials, the true American detective stories. Looking for talent, Hearst spotted Dix's work in the Times-Picayune, and after a year of persuasion, hired her for his New York Journal for $5,000 a year. Her advocacy for women to gain the right to vote can be observed in the early 20th century when she spoke at national suffrage conventions. The themes from her pro-suffrage convention themes and event appearances, as well as the columns and essays that she wrote for various newspapers and suffrage publications, arguably helped to shape the theme of women as victims as reported in her courtroom news stories. At times, Dix acted as judge or 13th juror because she covered the trials involving women during an era when women were not allowed to serve on juries, and thus not likely to have a fair shot of receiving legal protection. From 1901 to 1916, when Dix worked for the Journal, she used courtroom drama as a kind of morality play in which to teach the public about the victimization of women. Whether women were on trial for murder or had themselves met violent ends, it was the men in their lives who were on trial in the Dix articles. In addition to being the 13th juror, she was known as one of the 4 original sob sisters, whose news coverage focused on murder trials involving women. Other times, she was the interviewer, or even the investigator, who talked to suspects when they wouldn't speak to the district attorney, or she was the detective in search of witnesses who could not be located by authorities. These identities, sob sister, 13th juror, and third-party investigator, define Dix and arguably classify her style of news reporting of murder investigations as literary journalism. This particular form of writing, also known as new journalism or creative nonfiction, has its roots dated as far back as the late 19th century. In the decades after the Civil War, many journalists challenged the emerging idea that their job was to report factual statements, to strive for objectivity. They applied a narrative style of reporting that narrowed the distance between the reporter and the reader. In his study of literary journalism, scholar John C. Hartsock noted that by the 1890s, literary journalism reached a level of acceptance that was different not only from objective reporting, but also from the sensationalistic yellow press, and later in the early 20th century, the socially engaged muckrakers. Many writers of these time periods not only wrote for newspapers and magazines, but they also fought to proliferate their career in literature. Dix was no exception, as she also penned a series of Morandi novels that depicted her upbringing in Southern roots. However, her news reporting in the courtroom shares many qualities of narrative development that is characteristic in literature. Therefore, this paper fuses Dix's identities as a suffragist, sob sister, investigator, and a juror into a rich, more defined scholarly focus of Dix as a literary journalist not explored fully in journalism history, and argues how Dix, through the power of her voice in the fight for women's suffrage and her pen in America's early literary journalism movement, challenged patriarchy and women's demoralizing place in the legal system. Born into a Southern privilege predicated on slave wealth in which women of her class would be reared into the role of Southern lady, Dix lived through 9 decades of major cultural changes that affected race relations, concepts of marriage, and proper gender roles for women. At the peak of her popularity, Dix's advice column was carried in more than 200 newspapers across the globe, with more than 60 million readers. In 1894, Dix entered a newspaper industry that increasingly divided objective hard news from feminized soft news, limiting Dix's career path, but also offering new opportunities. Hired by New Orleans Picayune publisher Eliza Nicholson, Dix joined a newspaper that had already begun to employ the new journalism or literary elements set by the World and the New York Journal. She worked diligently, first reporting on births and deaths, moving her way up to recipes, and finally writing her Sunday salad feature that would eventually evolve into Dorothy Dix Talks. To understand the four roles that Dix embodied throughout her career, it is necessary to consider the historical context of the era in which she worked. Historian Frank Mott wrote that women flocked into newspaper work in the 80s, that's 1880s. By 1886, 500 females worked regularly on American newspapers. 2 years later, 200 women were working on New York newspapers. The 1900 census recorded 2,193 women in journalism, which represented 7.3% of the profession. However, few women worked as reporters in a newsroom, still dominated by men. Many women worked at home writing columns or articles targeted for female readers. This is what Dix did for 55 years, a fact that journalism students, scholars, and readers generally identify with her the most. Dix wrote her famous Dorothy Dix columns by relying on her life experiences, all the while covering sensational courtroom trials in a careful yet sympathetic way that told the story of the female victims involved. It wasn't until the early decades of the 20th century when women working at newspapers came to be seen as independent, hard-boiled dames, ready and willing to do anything their male counterparts would do to get a story. This created the dichotomy faced by most women at the turn of the century, maintaining a warm, feminine nature while still showcasing the masculine traits of journalism deemed essential for a successful reporter or editor. Historian Deke Rossell said, by the 1920s, newspapering was firmly established as a genre where women could take the leading roles, the active and successful parts, as well as men. This sentiment slowly would result in the blurring of gender lines among reporters, as newspapers simply wanted stories that were written well. However, Dix was one of the few female reporters who crafted a story in a way that would attract readers. In an interview with the Times-Picayune, she said newspapers played a large role in how stories were presented. The thing is, she played a leading role too, and she knew the impact her work had on others. Here's what she said. People want to read about crime. What is most history but the record of individual and national violence? Why, when we had a live murder story or live murder trial running in New York, it used to send the circulation up 100,000 a day. Newspaper records of great crimes surpass in thrills anything a writer of fiction can imagine, and they are real. They are the detective stories of real life, and people love detective stories. Of course, a lot depends on the way these stories are handled by a newspaper. But that too is life. Go out and buy some meat and vegetables. Give them to one cook. She'll produce a sloppy stew that you'll run a mile to avoid. Give them to another cook. With the same materials, she will produce a ragu that you travel across the world to eat. I always try to produce the ragu. Perhaps Dix's least discussed role involved her work as a suffragist. She delivered her speech titled The Woman with the Broom at the 34th Annual National American Suffrage Convention held in February 1902 at the First Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. In this address, which was published as 4 columns in the Woman's Journal, Dix pleaded for the domestic woman, the woman who is the mainstay of the world, who is back of every great enterprise, and who makes possible the achievements of men. The woman behind the broom, who is the hardest worked and worst paid laborer on the face of the earth. Years later, Dix again spoke at the National American Suffrage Convention held in April 1910 in Washington, D.C. In her address titled The Real Reason Why Women Cannot Vote, Dix imitated the dialect of the African American character featured in her Miranda novels. In addition to her pro-suffrage convention speeches and event appearances, Dix wrote columns and essays supporting women's right to vote. In a circular she penned for the National American Woman Suffrage Association, she outlined the social, political, and economic reasons why women should have the right to vote. One reason was that every question of politics affects the home, and particularly affects the woman in the home. Dix also discussed taxation, household budgets, morals, education, and other topics that favored women's suffrage. In addition to the circulars, Dix wrote three pamphlets on the subject of suffrage between 1912 and 1914 and served as an editor for the July 1904 edition of Progress, a publication of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Denoting a female journalist who specialized in soppy human interest stories or a woman writer who could wring tears, sob sister was in common use by 1910, partly because of the abundant newspaper coverage of the case of Harry Kendall Thaw for the murder of Stanford White, which is explained later in this presentation. Slang dictionaries date the term sob sister to about 1925 and define it as a woman news reporter who appeals to reader sympathies with her accounts of pathetic happenings. The term later was a derogatory sticker for women novelists whose work was deemed emotional. To capture the human angle or provide a sidebar to the main story, editors used female reporters, and as a result became known in the news circle as sob sisters. Most women reporters resented the label because it reinforced the stereotype of women as big-hearted but soft-minded, emotionally generous but intellectually sloppy. Most likely, Dix would have challenged the label. In a story that interviewed Dix and published in the Times-Picayune on Sunday, April 24th, 1927, Dix said, "In all the years I reported crime and murder trials, I was never once told to color my stories in the slightest degree. The only orders I ever received were to get all the facts I could and get them into the office as soon as I could." Major criminal trials were a significant form of public drama. Dix was well aware that the courtroom was a form of public theater, one controlled by men, and images of the stage filled her columns. Each of her stories was carefully worked, a complicated and sordid crime of human passion written into a simple lesson on the evils of infidelity, jealousy, greed, the dangers courted by negligent parents, or the temptations of poverty. The most striking aspect in her 15 years of work, when read as a whole, is the image it offers of the relationship between genders during the period. Dix particularly used her stories to teach her readers about the exploitation of women. Thus, the term sob sister was given to her. To illustrate the label of sob sister placed on Dix, the trial of Harry Kendall Thaw in 1907 provides the necessary context. Thaw was charged with the June 1906 murder of Stanford White, who was shot and killed in front of hundreds of witnesses on the rooftop garden of Madison Square. Born into one of Pittsburgh's richest families, Thaw was heir to a coal mining fortune. White, who had designed popular landmarks in New York City, such as the Washington Square Arch and the original Madison Square Garden, was a married man in his early 50s and had a string of young mistresses. Thaw's young wife, Evelyn Nesbit Thaw, became the central figure of the trial. She testified that she lost her virginity at the age of 16 to White after he drugged her with champagne. Her testimony essentially helped to save her husband, who was acquitted of the charge. Dix captured on Evelyn Thaw in the trial as readers were interested in, quote, "the little butterfly woman who was the cause of the tragedy and to whom every thread of the tangled evidence goes back," unquote. Dix also sympathetically described Evelyn Thaw as someone who could not be held responsible for the tragedy. She wrote, "Whatever her faults, she has never had a chance, poor little plaything of fate." Dix's role as a sob sister influenced her unofficial second title of 13th Juror, reporting the case with the voice she did because women at the time were not allowed to serve on juries. She and the other female journalists of the day earned special notoriety simply by being the only authorized female observers, since women were not allowed to appear in the courtroom. Dix felt women were denied a fair trial by a jury of their peers. She felt that no man could fully understand the motives and actions of a woman. By interpreting the trial for her readers, she also was interpreting it, or humanizing it, for the law, thus anticipating that one day there would be female jurors. Furthermore, Dix suggested that women would make decisions as a juror based on emotions. If a woman jury acquitted Thaw, and I think it would do more so on its emotions, unquote. In addition, by being 13th juror, Dix helped to shape and influence public opinion through her decisions of what to include in her articles and what not to mention. In the Harry Thaw trial, prosecutors tried to show the jury that Evelyn Thaw was not an innocent victim, but rather was a career-minded woman whose ambitions and desires were written in a diary that she kept. Dix and a few of the other reporters chose to play down the diary's significance, whereas their male counterparts capitalized on this portion of the trial. Dix wrote that Evelyn's cross-examination, quote, was brought to a dramatic and pathetic close by the foolish introduction of her schoolgirl diary, unquote, and called it, quote, a quaint and rather piteous human document, unquote. Dix's ability to communicate with suspects, victims, anyone who did not want to speak to authorities or chose not to say a word, was recognized by her editors and attorneys alike. William Travers Jerome, District Attorney of New York, quote, has sent for her time after time to talk to prisoners who would talk to no other human being. And when the District Attorney of New York could not unlock those lips, Dorothy Dix could. They turned out the contents of their hearts to her as you would turn out the contents of a shallow drawer, unquote. When a stepmother somewhere in New Jersey had murdered an 18-month-old stepchild, authorities would not allow the mother to communicate with others, and the family would say nothing. But Foster Coates, the city editor of the New York Journal, knew they would talk to Dix. In fact, he said, I know one person who can get somebody down there to talk. In another case, this one against Josephine Terranova, who was charged with murder in the stabbing deaths of her aunt and uncle, Dix learned the life story of this teenager in a series of interviews in prison where Josephine was held. Josephine, who was worked as a slave by her aunt and uncle, escaped by marrying an Italian youth, but the uncle continued to taunt her. This forced the husband to cast away Josephine. The girl, claiming to act on a command from God, returns to kill the uncle and the aunt. The girl was acquitted largely because of the story Dix brought to public attention. Through these cases in which Dix acted as an investigator, she relied on her personable quality to connect with suspects and victims in a manner that was not contentious. Plus, she recognized women as victims, not as suspects, in these cases that often were controlled by a male-dominated legal system. Using her advocacy for women's voting rights, Dix used her pen and voice to confront the patriarchal culture that defined women's demoralizing place in the legal system in the early 20th century. Dix is among a long tradition of female journalists who used their verbal power to shape public discourse, both in and out of the newsroom, as evidenced by her pro-suffrage work. She set forth a legacy that encourages female and male journalists to be fearless and challenge harmful state policies and corporate strategies that affect humanity. In her 15 years of courtroom reporting, Dix challenged social and journalistic conventions through literary journalism. First, she long advocated that women should be included on juries since, quote, it is practically impossible to convict a young and good-looking woman. Her tears contain a chemical that dissolves the average man's backbone and common sense, unquote. Second, whether she was labeled a sob sister, 13th juror, or investigator, woven into the context of her role also as a suffragist, Dix sought to learn about the major players in the trial. Dix's journalism portfolio, primarily in her trial reporting, reflects the talent she had in disseminating the information in a way that did not color the events in the courtroom, but painted a picture for the reader. During her tenure with the New York Journal, Dix placed herself in the shoes of those accused, interviewed them, sought their past, and shared their stories. She internalized their plight for readers. On each trial assignment, she illustrated her role as a sob sister, 13th juror, or investigator. Although a friend and sympathizer of women, Dix maintained the values and attitudes of the professional journalist. She worked diligently to meet deadlines and work well with her editors. Regardless of where ethical values might lie between the two historical periods, Dix was a prominent female pioneer in journalism history. and she was the architect of sentiment. As many scholars have noted, 19th century sentimental narratives tended to encourage readers to identify with the sufferings of the disempowered, women, and children. A Providence, Rhode Island newspaper reporter said at a trial, quote, "For years, no great American murder trial looked complete until Dorothy Dix took her place at the press table. Dorothy Dix has arrived. The trial can now proceed," unquote. But how well Dix reported from the press table was not what made her the world's highest paid female journalist of her day. It was her interest in people, intertwined with her determination to stand against a patriarchal institution, that made her work as a suffragist, sob sister, 13th juror, and investigator humane and respected. Dix said in an interview that humanity's interest in great crimes and the trials that follow them is not morbid. It is no sign of warped mentality. It is the eternal human interest in the eternal human drama that so often becomes melodramatic. It is taking from real life, the stuff of real life, instead of taking tales from the imagination of a novelist. I thank you for your attention, and these are the references used on the slides in this presentation.